The story that I'm about to read begins with a tragic loss for Jesus. Just before this story, we learn of the death of John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin. And in Matthew's telling of this story of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has just received this, and you get a sense that he needs to get away and process this loss, this grief. That makes what happens that much more amazing and wonderful, I think. Hear God's scriptures for us as it's found in Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." And then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's a story told about Mahatma Gandhi. As he stepped aboard a train one day, one of his shoes accidentally slipped off and landed along the side of the tracks. And because the train had already begun to move, he couldn't reach down to grab it. And so immediately he took the other shoe off of his foot and threw it out next to the track, as close to the other one as he could. A fellow passenger, clearly puzzled, asked Gandhi why he had done this, to which Gandhi answered, "Well, the poor man who finds the first shoe lying on the track, well, now he'll have a pair to use." What amazes me about that story is not that Gandhi gave up his shoes, but how quickly he responded in that moment. What an amazing quality to give in that way without a second thought. In today's story from Matthew, Jesus seems to be inviting his followers into a similar way of being in the world, where we not only recognize a problem, but see an opportunity for a compassionate and thoughtful response. And we act on that without a second thought. After hearing the news of John's death, Jesus is trying to get some time alone. Who can't identify with that? But the crowds know what Jesus is capable of, and they have a desperate need. And so they follow him around the edge of the lake, and when they're reunited on the other side, the text simply says that Jesus had compassion on them and healed the sick among them, without a second thought, I imagine. Many scholars spend time trying to find a way to explain the miraculous feeding of the multitude and miss the gift of Jesus' healing presence and compassionate response in the midst of his grief. Compassion literally means to suffer alongside. Jesus and the disciples and the crowds were in it together, sharing their physical, their emotional, perhaps their spiritual suffering. One author I read wondered whether anyone in that occasion took time to ask Jesus how he was doing after his loss. Did anyone sit down next to Jesus just to be with him in his grief? Who knows? With nighttime approaching, the disciples were understandably concerned. "Send them away so they can get something to eat," they said. And what must they have thought when Jesus came back at them with the words, the command really, "You give them something to eat." Matthew doesn't tell the readers the source of the loaves and fish. We learn from John's account of the story that it was a little boy that had the fish and the loaves of bread. All we know here in Matthew is that there is enough, amazingly. For when the gifts are presented to God and blessed, they become sufficient to meet the needs of the great crowd. The late Charlie Cowser, who was my New Testament professor at Columbia Seminary, wrote about this text that the disciples in this story are enrolled into the life and work of Jesus Christ. They here symbolize what it means to participate in the compassionate ministry of Jesus. Now, DCPC is no stranger to compassionate ministries, especially as they relate to addressing hunger. We have lots of opportunities for you to help feed others. There's our 10 cents a meal offering on the first Sunday of each month. Those gifts are combined with other churches' offerings and shared with ministries throughout our presbytery that help bring an end to hunger. Your physical food donations, which are brought each Sunday and placed in the grocery carts at the entrances, are shared with loaves and fishes and sent to our food pantries in the communities to help hungry neighbors. We work with organizations like Feed NC and Angels and Sparrows and Crisis Assistance Ministries to feed hungry neighbors and educate and equip them for a more promising tomorrow. We give groceries to our grocery bag ministry every Thursday afternoon and deliver them to Angels and Sparrows and Caterpillar Ministries in Huntersville. We make bag lunches to share with children who normally during the school year receive free and reduced lunch, but during the summer struggle to put enough food on the table for the children. There's one more opportunity for that in a couple of weeks on August 24th if you want to sign up. We prepare meals during the winter months for our guests at Room in the Inn and provide holiday meals during Thanksgiving and Christmas for those who can't afford them. In addition, your financial gifts to our Minister's Discretionary Fund buy grocery cards that we can give to anyone who stops by and is in need. That, along with utility and rent assistance, helps make a difference in our community. Globally, both of our international partnerships focus in part on feeding children. In Nicaragua, our funds purchase 2 large food baskets each year for each of the families of scholarship recipients. And you've already heard about the feeding of the children in Kenya. The kitchen staff is paid for in part through our donations, along with the food that they buy and prepare each school day for breakfast and lunch for those 140 students. Okay, Jesus, we are giving them something to eat. But maybe this is about more than just food. In this story, the disciples realize the late hour and the people have a need, but they don't know exactly how they can help. They don't see it. They see the problem, but not the solution. Jesus invites us to walk alongside others in their suffering, even while we are suffering, and to give what we can. To trust that God will bless that gift and multiply it. Our recent confirmation class is learning a little bit about this. They've been studying the Matthew 25 initiative throughout the year. And one of the pieces of their class is to complete a project that helps them live into that idea of serving others in need. And so they've been trying to pay attention to what problems exist in the community that need their attention and what little bit they can offer to make a difference. They're not only recognizing needs like trails in need of maintenance or families without books or kids who can't afford baseball camp, but they're putting their time and energy and skills to work improving those trails for walkers and bikers and runners, and providing children's books to those who can't afford them, and providing free baseball camps to children who can't afford those, and much, much more. Each of the confirmands has their own project. Another great example of this comes from the story behind one of our mission partners, E2D, Eliminate the Digital Divide. It all started with teenager Franny Millen, the daughter of Pat Millen and Eileen Keeley, who asked one day after school how her lower income classmates without access to technology could do all of their homework assignments. She didn't just notice the problem, but she enrolled others into the solution as they entered into the situations of families who experienced that digital divide each and every day. And now, 10 years later, they're about to celebrate their 10-year anniversary. They, along with lots of other volunteers and staff, have given over 37,000 laptops, along with Wi-Fi, training, and support to families throughout Charlotte-Mecklenburg system and beyond. Hallelujah. You may know that members of our church recently returned from a mission trip to Kenya and Nicaragua. During that trip, as I mentioned to the children, we took students from the school on a field trip. While we were on that field trip, one of the students, whose name was Alan, was noticeably struggling. He has some developmental disabilities, and not only that, the week before had taken an overdose of some medicine, and so was very confused, wasn't able to participate with the rest of the group. One of our helpers, his name was Gideon. He's not a paid staff person, he's just a church member, a young adult. He was on the trip with us, and he decided to spend the day with Alan. He just saw that Alan was struggling. He came alongside. They spent the whole day together, walking hand in hand, watching the other children playing. And Gideon really inspired our group as we watched him give of himself in that very loving and compassionate way. He didn't just say, I'll let somebody else deal with this. He did what he could, which was just to be with Alan. This quality of a compassionate presence, I think, is nurtured by a couple of other things. First of all, gratitude. We see in Jesus' feeding of the 5,000, giving thanks to God for the gifts, and then sharing those and trusting. In gratitude, we acknowledge all that we have been given, and we have been blessed in so many ways. So being grateful is an important part of our compassionate journey. Secondly, showing humility. And what I mean by that is acknowledging that the gifts we have are gifts from God, that God has blessed us with so much, and it's not meant to be hoarded, but to be shared. Those qualities help us live into the fullness of what Jesus calls us to as a compassionate people. He models for us the actions in his own life to give of himself, to show gratitude and humility so that we might do that very same thing. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is quoted as saying that in life, everyone decides whether they will walk in the creative light of altruism or the darkness of destructive selfishness. This is the judgment, he says. Life's persistent and most urgent question is, what are we doing for others? You may have read the recent Charlotte Observer article about Cyril Prabhu, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, who started a nonprofit called Proverbs 226. That comes from the verse, train up a child in the way they should go. This ministry helps reunite and reconcile children with parents who have experienced incarceration. And the organization's making plans to expand that ministry by creating a trade school on the grounds of one of North Carolina's correctional institutes. It's just an hour or so from Charlotte. The name of the new ministry is 5 and 2 Trade School, in honor of the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the little boy who gave 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Prabhu says that the students coming to this trade school may not yet have their lives all together, but if you give what you have in your hands, God will multiply it. Friends, I believe that that is our call today, to bring what we have in our hands and to trust that God will multiply that and bless the world around us. We're called to do more than to see the problems, but to respond in a compassionate and thoughtful way. without a second thought, offering what we have and trusting God for the outcome. So may we do that together as God's people and learn every day to walk more and more in the ways of Jesus. We made a commitment at 9:45 to bless little Madeline Parker Ridenauer with that kind of attention by modeling that kind of life for her as she grows in faith. And I invite you to live into that promise of our congregation as well, not only for little Madeline, but for our new members who are going to be joining us in just a few minutes. Actually, they already joined us, but you'll get to meet them in a moment. And together, with all of our many gifts, we can, with God's help, impact this world for good. I close with this simple prayer poem titled As Jesus Did. Loving God, help us to be Christ to all those whose lives touch ours. May we see others as Jesus did, with eyes of compassion. May we listen as Jesus did to the cries of broken hearts and a broken world. May we reach out to others as Jesus did, with healing and hope. May we serve others as Jesus did, with no strings attached. May we break bread with others as Jesus did, that the hungry may be fed. May we celebrate with others as Jesus did, your abundant provision. Loving God, help us to be Christ to all those whose lives touch ours.